person without community is like a tree without roots. Людина без людей, що дерево без коріння.
Hi, this is Anna Kostecka. Welcome to What Works Across Cultures, my podcast on the art and science of global leadership and teamwork. I've explored this topic for over 15 years. Now I'm bringing experts from all around the world to talk about how culture shapes the way we lead, communicate, and collaborate. And of course, what works across cultures. Join our conversation. Hello, welcome. In this episode, we'll talk about community and how culture impacts its definition and the way we build it and rebuild it. As always, I have a disclaimer for you. We are going to be talking about cultural differences. And by cultural differences, I mean the patterns in which how we behave and how we interpret the behavior of others. And I want to make it very clear that people are complex and culture is only one of the things that impact our behavior. So keep it in mind. Today, I invited Maria Andruchiw. Maria is a community organizer, activist, and cultural advocate. She is the vice president of the Poland-Ukraine Socio-Cultural Association, co-organizer and communications and marketing manager of Ukrainian Spring Festival, and a member of the Council for the Integration of Migrants at the Poznań City Hall. She is also a founder of Initiative Angel Headquarters, which provides aid to Ukraine, supporting hospitals, soldiers, paramedics, and civilians. For the past 10 years, Maria has been actively involved in cultural diplomacy and community organizing. So as you see, she is a wonderful person to talk about the community. And I'm sure that many of your insights, Maria, are going to be applicable to the workplaces. I'm so happy to have you here with me. Welcome to the podcast. And if you would like to add something to the introduction, please do.
Hello, Anna. I'm really happy to be here and to be sharing my experience. And I think that the introduction was so complex in a way that there is nothing more I can add.
Perfect. So maybe let's start with a question that I often ask my guests. Is there a proverb, Ukrainian proverb, that is connected to the topic of the community that you can think of?
Yeah, there is one that comes to my mind. It sounds just like a person without community is like a tree without roots. And this is something that really describes Ukrainian and something that you will probably discover while talking about Ukrainians today.
Mm-hmm. So a person without a community is like a tree without roots. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Beautiful. You know, I really wanted to have a guest on the podcast that is going to be talking from the perspective of Ukraine, because Poland and Ukraine are so similar in many ways, but there are also a lot of differences. We'll talk about them, I'm sure. So let's maybe move into the core discussion. And I want to ask you about your perception of Ukrainian culture. And of course, you know, this is going to be your perception. Not everyone is going to be like that, but we're talking about patterns. So one of the most widely researched dimensions of culture is individualism and collectivism. And it describes how kind of people see themselves in a society. In individualistic cultures, people think about themselves mainly as individuals, and community is something you kind of opt into based on the interests. And in more of a collectivistic cultures, people see themselves mainly as a part of the group. It could be a community, team, family. And cross-cultural researchers place Ukraine in the middle of this spectrum. Does that match your experience? Where would you place Ukrainian culture?
Well, I would say that Ukrainians are individualistic in spirit, but collectivistic in practice when it's needed. Because we can see that starting from the independence of Ukraine after the Soviet Union collapsed, a more individualistic approach started to appear. Even though people used to live in a very collectivistic community for a long time, we can see that dignity and some kind of resilience that Ukrainians have started to appear more, let's say, more frequently. We can finally see that Ukrainians has never been that fully collectivistic community, actually. And in the same time, this collectivism actually is more visible when the crisis is coming to Ukraine. We can see that every time since 2014, and even more after the full-scale invasion in 2022 started, we can see that this extraordinary culture of solidarity emerged, and volunteers, neighbors, local initiatives, NGO organizations stepped into these community building processes in a more effective way than institutions did. So we can see that this community spirit was more visible in a time of crisis. And this is something that actually caused this collectivistic development even more deep. But in the same time, we can see that younger generation in Ukraine is completely different. And this European individualism is also very visible, but it's more in spirit, I would say.
In spirit, and in the times of the crisis, you go to the kind of the roots. This extraordinary response of people in Ukraine to the war in terms of how the community organized and provided support is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about the community and what it means. It's really interesting what you shared. So you already mentioned the impact of the crisis. And I'm thinking about, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022, that was followed by the displacement of over 5 million people. How did it impact the community?
Well, it is something that I am continuously being impressed by, how Ukrainians adapted to the crisis in a sense of taking out the most positive effect out of it. When in 2022, when the full-scale invasion started, we could see an emerge of initiatives, not an institutions or an NGO organizations, but initiatives, the local one, that were bringing people together, were helping civilians, medicals, older people on each level that is actually possible to be active at. And it was something that really impressed me a lot. For instance, in Kyiv, where at the very first weeks, people were trying to get out of the city. Many of them stayed there and were, feeding the older people and animals. They were given cars for free for those who had a huge families just to get out of the city. And this tremendous solidarity that came with the crisis was really impressive. And in the same time, when looking at people who were forced to be displaced and were forced to get out of the country for the sake of their children, and those who we met here in Poland especially, I can see that after some time when they have kind of adapted to the situation, to the new circumstances and new society and new language, etc., they started to build another small communities over here. So for instance, I can say that one of the aspects was a volunteering. I am running a volunteering hub from the very beginning, and many of displaced people actually were coming to our hub just to give us some support and help, even though they were, traumatized. It was a very demanding period for them because they had to, to adapt to the new place, sometimes without, a language knowledge, without money and job and, some kind of stability. And also the other aspect that showed this huge resilience and community strength is that people started to create some cultural initiatives, for instance, chorus, some artistic workshops where they were just meeting all together, donating for the army, and also doing some, artistic stuff together. And for now, we can see at least in Poznań, the city that is not that huge, I would say, comparing to the others in Poland, we can count at least 10 or even 15, small initiatives and also formally registered organizations that has been created by displaced Ukrainians, where they are, making some protective nets for army. They are, baking some food for the medical staff in hospitals. So they are trying to do at least something they can, do for Ukraine, even being that far away from home. And the main thing that puts them together is that, feeling of common aim, common mission, and being together, actually.
So they're trying to build the roots coming back to the proverb, right, from the beginning, and thinking about how to kind of translate some of that learnings and some of those perspectives into the workplace. And I'm thinking that, a lot of workplaces really strive to build a culture where people have this common goal, have this feeling of the community and a connection. So I wanted to ask you, what helps build this community, and also what destroys trust, because this trust is a key thing in this feeling of community.
Yeah, it is a very complex question, but I think
I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I'm just trying to put it into words. Talking about Ukrainian perspective, I would say that the trust and being very direct is something that makes Ukrainians in a working place, working environment be more, I'd say it, to give more out of their work, to be more engaged so they can feel that they are part of something really what matters. And I think that it's not about, structure and formality. It's more about support, reliability, being all together, also in a success and, and some problems, because Ukrainians tend to be more, direct in, expressing themselves. But in the same time, they really appreciate more when you are more sincere and honest with them and open and supportive. And even though you might be a great, professional, very formal, following the rules, when you are opening up to that person, that can bring more, let's say, effects, impact out of that person actually. So being direct and being more, supportive and honest can bring a huge difference. And talking about destroying trust, I would say that being actually too formal beyond being honest, like striving to the aim, if you are following a goal and you are being too formal and, following the structure more than being, honest with your workers that are Ukrainians, that can actually kind of destroy your trust.
So let me just ask a clarification around that. So you mean that you're kind of more focused just on the goal and you're not kind of thinking about the people?
I was trying to say the opposite, but I think that I just put it in the wrong words. That actually the goal is very important, but the way to the goal should be, based and built on honesty and trust and humor and support, but not being too formal and following the structures.
So those things are important in building the community. So the directness, like honesty. And here it's, when you look at the comparison between Poland and Ukraine, actually Ukrainians are a little bit more direct on the communication scale than the Poles. But we conceptualize, I think, honesty similarly. So just tell me what you mean, right?
Yeah, you are totally right. Ukrainians and Poles are very similar in these terms, but there is something that people sometimes perceive even in a negative way, this directness. I think it's also changing, of course, because it is very, very subjective perspective. This is something I used to observe from Ukrainians, from that time when I moved out actually. But even now, when I see Ukrainians that are coming to Poland now on these times, I can see that they are trying to kind of open up to you more quickly than Poles used to, actually. They are trying to talk to you about your emotions, about your, your family, your hobby. They are trying, and they're doing the same. They're opening up. They are telling you about the way they live toward what they are doing, what they are interested in. This is something very nice. But in the same time, I think that they are not that formal that people used to behave here in the workplace. Poles, from my perspective, are more structured. They need some more time to open up and to build a trust in Ukrainians. And from this perspective, some people can perceive Ukrainians as too direct. I mean, they are kind of, going through these processes too fast sometimes. And I think that there is one other thing that differs us, not the positive one, is that very often Ukrainians are being perceived through the stereotypes about, some working skills, some competences, an approach also. Some people used to think that Ukrainians are not that much responsible and not, taking this responsibility too deep, for instance. But it's not the truth. This is something that has been built by the stereotypes. And I can see that especially the younger generation doesn't really meet these stereotypes like at all. They're completely different. And I think it is also changing because when I came to Poland 12 years ago, Ukrainians were actually working on factories only in these low qualified jobs. And it is changing. It's not the same anymore.
Thank you so much for bringing the topic of stereotypes. Every time I talk about cultural differences or I facilitate a workshop, I make sure to make the distinction between cultural differences and stereotypes. And because stereotypes are really often a barrier, they're just those fixed beliefs that you apply to everyone. And here we're talking about patterns, like the most common behaviors, way of looking at things. And we kind of started talking about the differences between Poland and Ukraine. And this is really where I want to get into. So you already mentioned one that was connected to, I would say, actually building trust. When I look at the kind of cross-cultural frameworks, one of the big difference between Poland and Ukraine is how you build trust. And in Ukraine, you build it more through relationships. So you want to get to know the person. So I think your example of, talking about what are your interests, this is how you build trust. In Poland, we do it a little bit less. So here would be kind of this one difference, right? What are some other ones?
The other ones, I think that the other aspect that comes to my mind is flexibility. It is something that Ukrainians have gained through the time of crisis and changes, the political and historical changes in Ukraine. And this is something that Ukrainians learned to adapt to their life and to implement into their life. And I'm talking about, being able to find a one night solution to the crisis or a problem or just a task at work that appears and being able to resolve it very quickly, even under the very unpredictable circumstances, under the big, huge pressure. And this is something that I can see is more developed in Ukrainian society than, for instance, in Polish ones. Doesn't mean that Poles doesn't have this flexibility that they do, but I'm talking about, being able to work very quickly under the huge pressure. And this is actual natural because even now we can see very good example of strong and very demanding winter that we all faced this year. In Kyiv, my friends used to, to find a solution to heat up their homes and rooms in such a different way that I could never think about, actually. But they just had to because of the circumstances. And this is something that actually brings good impact into this adaptiveness of Ukrainians. Because when talking about working places, after these circumstances and, life experience, they are able to come up with an ideas of resolving problem more quickly than they used to. And I think that this is something that also differs Poles and Ukrainians, not even Poles. I think we can, implement this example to the other European countries too.
So we have so far this kind of how we build trust and how we faster maybe talk about things that are more personal, this adaptability, which is for me very interesting because this is how I would perceive Polish culture, but it's always kind of, a spectrum, right? So probably Ukrainian culture would be even more on the spectrum.
Yes. Another aspect that can be also mentioned here, it is context. I think that being sensitive to the context nowadays is something that we have to also take into account when talking and cooperating with Ukrainians. Because since the full-scale war began, many Ukrainians have been living with constant emotional stress, uncertainty, concern for family and friends back in Ukraine and also in Ukraine. And I think that this is something that has also changed the way we communicate. Even when I'm talking to my friends or partners in Ukraine, I'm trying to take all of the, past events. Even yesterday, Shelley shooting, for instance, that were in every news, every media broadcasted, I have to take into account these things too, because I feel that this may impact on the emotional adaptiveness, the level of stress they also have. And it doesn't mean that we have to, always just think about emotional aspect when cooperating with Ukrainians. But this is something that unfortunately is happening on a daily basis. And we just need to have more sensitivity to the context. But I think that this is something that is also applicable to Poles back in the 80s when Poland was transforming from the socialistic country into the democratic. And Poles also have a lot of historical background that actually is still impacting on the way they are cooperating and doing stuff. I think it's more applicable to our parents, of course, and this generation, but still we can, face the humor, some stories that can, be sometimes mentioned. They are coming back from that time and they're still, alive, let's say.
Mm-hmm. And thank you so much for mentioning the context. I think in a modern workplace, in a global workplace, this will apply not only to the Ukrainians, but there are many countries in which there are wars right now and it impacts, your colleagues. So I think having the sensitivity is really, really important.
Yeah, you're right.
Mm-hmm. And so you've been living in Poland for 12 years, and part of your volunteer activities is around integration. So we work with a lot of Ukrainians and Poles. Could you give an example or think about an example of a workplace situation when maybe cultural differences have been playing out?
Yeah, I think that I could say that one of the main aspects that I can observe when working with Ukrainians and Poles is that due to the circumstances in Ukraine and many political changes, Ukrainians doesn't really have a trust to the institutions in general. And I would say that this is something that differs us a lot. Ukrainians are striving to resolve a problem or a task in their way. Let's say being more, trying to find their own solutions. And instead, when Poles are kind of following more the structure, the institutions, the formal regulations, long term institutional processes. And I think that one day Ukrainians will also gain this, trust to the institutions, and in general, democratic society will develop more in Ukraine, which is actually happening. But still, I can see a huge difference that Ukrainians all rely more on personal networks, communities, informal support systems, some kind of groups, chats, etc., but not the institutions instead. In the same time, when Poles are more, this structure, they are following the civic responsibility more. I can say that civil society in general in Poland is very well developed. And this is something that we as Ukrainians are admiring in Poland and taking this example and bringing some good practices and know-how to Ukraine actually. From this perspective, I would totally say that Poland went more far than us. And this is something that actually brings a huge hope that actually it is possible to develop a democratic society after being under the socialistic and communistic, government that long, actually. Because I can see that this Ukrainian past, communistic past, Soviet Union regime actually impacted on people a lot. And the lack of trust to the institutions also comes to the working places, even in every single process in their lives, you can see these aspects too.
For me, it's really fascinating to hear you because oftentimes when I work with organizations, I help global teams collaborate better. Poland would be more similar to Ukraine on a lot of the dimensions, on a lot of the differences. And even when it comes to trusting in the system, following the procedure, Poles in those kind of circumstances would be those rule breakers rather than rule makers. So it's really fascinating to hear it from this perspective, right? Again, I'm reminded about that it's relative. The comparisons are relative. So Based on your experience and expertise, what do people tend to get wrong when they work with colleagues from Ukraine?
I think I have mentioned this already, that the aspect of stereotypes about Ukrainians, that they used to break rules always, they used to be less qualified at a working place, that they used to, as I said, break some regulations. It's not always the truth. Of course, there are some people who are still following, unfortunately, the stereotypes. And I really feel sad for such. For instance, the working agencies in Poland, I can see that they are constantly, unfortunately, narrowing the stereotypes. They doesn't exist without a reason, of course. But in the same time, the majority is trying to, to change the approach, to learn more from the European perspective. And for instance, after the full-scale war invasion had started, we could see a huge amount of very well-qualified Ukrainians who came to Poland and to the other countries and who were trying to find a job. And the sad thing is that many of them had to, start working in a lower qualified jobs other than they used to work at, because of the lack of, the language knowledge, for instance. And it was very traumatic for them also, because they had to decrease their, expectations and everything. It takes some time for sure, and I'm pretty sure it was hard for them. But I could see that there is a huge amount of people who have a very good qualifications and they are very well educated. They have a lot of very good skills that are also needed here. What else? What else? What else?
And I would say that absolutely, like, this brain waste and, people that are moving to a different country, especially if they have to flee, just having survival jobs is
Yeah.
an issue, like, around the world. In my previous life, when I was living in Canada, like, I did work on the issue with some kind of a pilot project. So it's an issue that is close to my heart for sure.
I'm pretty sure that everyone who is facing this displacement that is being forced by some crisis, is facing the same problem as you said, survival jobs, etc. Yeah.
And because I think we covered some of the differences, right? So people might be surprised that the colleagues would ask questions about private life, maybe. The colleagues might be surprised that people tend to kind of like fix things without following the formal procedures.
Yeah.
Maybe what's going to be easier for you also is to just answer the question, like, what surprises Ukrainians working in Poland or other European countries?
There are a few things that I would mention because, as you said before, we are still very similar. But there is something that I would like to mention here. When Ukrainian business or a startup comes to Poland, many of my colleagues who actually have started their business or entrepreneurship job in Poland, they can see that Ukrainian customer is more demanding than the Polish one, in the sense of the expectations of the direct communication that Ukrainians used to have in Ukraine. For instance, when a woman comes to the beauty studio, she's expecting her that the workers will make some coffee for her. They will ask how she's doing, how she's feeling, and they will start some, small talk with her before they will start serving a job. And this is something that is not that usual in Poland. I mean, you are just coming, you are getting your product, that is totally okay. But Ukrainians are more demanding in this way, actually. I can constantly observe this from forums, threads, or some Facebook chats where people are sharing like, oh, I love to be coming to the Ukrainian studios in Poland because I love to feel like the center of the universe at that moment. Of course, I'm exaggerating. What I'm trying to say is that they are more focused on this emotion, this emotional experience that they will bring with them. This is something that actually differs Polish and Ukrainian businesses. And what else? I would say bureaucracy, but not in this bad, negative way. It's just more about following the regulations and structure. In Poland, some things can take way longer than in Ukraine. And very often Ukrainians are being surprised by some, very basic procedures that could take a couple of days in Ukraine, and they are taking a couple of weeks in Poland instead. And this is the matter of these, regulations that are, more complex, maybe more wide builded and stuff. In Ukraine, many things can be made by taking a few steps in an app, for instance. And in Poland, it's not the same. But there is one very important thing that has to be mentioned here. It has not always been like that in Ukraine, because even though the war is going on, it is actually kind of speeding up the processes and the formal ones too. So 5 years ago, we didn't really have this app where everything was put into one place. For instance, paying a bill, even applying for the marriage certificate through the one app. We didn't have this, of course, 5 years ago, but the war caused all these processes speeded up a lot. So I would say that these things are still, differs.
And when you mentioned this example of the client in a beauty place, I was also thinking about one difference that sometimes I hear when I talk to the Ukrainians that are working in Poland. It's a little bit about kind of how the workplaces are structured and how hierarchical are there. Do you see this difference as well or not?
For sure. It is a very good point, actually, that I didn't mention, but still, in Ukraine, you can strongly see how hierarchy is actually playing a huge role in working places. It is still something that many Ukrainians would argue with me, but I still think and see that Ukraine is a very patriarchal country. And you can see that in companies, you still can observe that many women are, playing a role of more administrative work, when CEOs and managers and the leaders are those who are male representatives. And this hierarchy is actually still playing a huge role, but it is also changing, and it will take a lot of time, I'm pretty sure, because when we're talking about Kyiv and big companies, for instance, in this city, I can see from my friend that this tendency is changing. But look at my mother working place. My mom is working in a small local cultural institution. There is still, this tendency of a huge hierarchical ties, let's say, that they have to follow, and it is very hard to break them.
And thank you for bringing those distinctions. Like we can see them in Poland and a lot of different countries in Canada and actually pretty much in every country that, even though you will have a pattern at the level of a nation, then there's going to be a big differences compared to the regions and how big is the place and also what type of the company you're working in, right? Typically like public institutions or military, police tend to be much more hierarchical. So thank you for bringing this distinction. So summing up in a little bit, what are a few tips for working across cultures that you would give the listeners? In particular, we're working with colleagues from Ukraine, but it could be also broader.
I think that the most and the best cross-cultural collaborations it happens when people are staying curious toward each others and ask questions respectfully and focus on listening rather than assuming and rather than evaluating them as workers. I think that it doesn't really matter what nationality we actually have. We have to learn how to be curious toward those cultures and to have to discover the best parts of it and not following the stereotypes, because every culture, every nationality, every country is in some way unique, and only respect and being curious can actually bring this harmony, let's say, in a working place. And as far as we stay respectful and sensitive to the context, as far we can, build a strong connection, strong community that is bringing some impact and doing a good job.
I love this tip around curiosity. Recently, I was facilitating a workshop around working effectively with India, and a colleague of mine who's a specialist in Indian culture joined. And one of her last tips was stay curious, not furious. And it really spoke to me. Based on what you said, I also want to highlight this. One of the barriers in good global collaboration, apart from stereotypes, is this illusion of sameness, right? And this is especially acute when you have cultures that are similar. So yes,
Yeah.
Poland and Ukraine, in this particular example, we share so many things. On a high level, there are a lot of similarities, but there are also differences. So we need to stay curious and, not make assumptions. And then what are the most important things you would like the listeners to know about community and the power of networks?
The most powerful things that I would like listeners to take out of this conversation is that being different is a great value add. And as far as we are staying respectful, curious, and open minded, we can bring a very strong and active community that is striving to the same aim and having the same mission. Also, to not be afraid of the crises, because this is something that actually helps us also to build adaptiveness and resilience, even though it may sound as a huge challenge for us in one moment. After we will overcome it, we will be able to see a huge, added values to the overall situation. So to not be afraid of crises and to build community where everyone is respectful and curious toward each other's.
I love your optimism towards crises. I think we live in a world in which there are many and they're coming constantly. So, as horrible as they are, and they are, there's no question about it. There's also sometimes something beautiful that can come out of them. And I want to comment on your first answer around difference. When I was preparing for this podcast, when I was thinking about the community, especially community in crisis, what kind of stood out to me is this social theory of the weak ties. And in the situations of the crisis, it's actually not your closest network that will give you the most of the support, because you tend to see or share the same resources. But it's actually the people that you don't necessarily know so well, like your acquaintances, that have access to different resources and information. So building those communities, weak ties with people that maybe you don't know so well, it's extremely, extremely helpful in the crisis situation. So Maria, it has been a great conversation. Like, there are so many things that I'm thinking about. And I will ask you the last question that I tend to ask, all of my guests. What was the most valuable thing for you that you take away from this conversation?
What I'm taking out of this conversation is difference is a value in general. Because I used to feel less valuable actually when I came to Poland. I used to feel like I'm not enough. I have to prove everyone that I have a knowledge, I have a skill, that I am actually the person that has its own, perspective and opinion. And at the moment when I actually realized that being enough for myself is just, appreciating that I'm coming from this country, this is my root, but that's okay. I mean, I have to just accept this. I don't necessarily have to explain the other people or to make an excuse for the other, bad, stereotype that there is functioning in a society about my nationality. I'm not responsible for this. And at the moment when I actually realized that this difference is a huge value, not for Ukrainians, but also for Poles and the other nationalities there I was coming across in my career here, I realized that it is a huge value that I should be proud of, and everyone should be proud of. Every Pole should be proud of them being Poles. Every other nationality should be proud of them being themselves. And we don't have to blur these differences. We can stand up for them, and that's totally okay. And that's totally okay.
Yes, a lot of studies show that diverse teams are more effective, but there's a caveat there. It's only when the differences are actually acknowledged and leveraged. If you hide them, this is not going to help in terms of innovation and creativity. So you kind of, like, when I listened to what you said, I thought about this proverb that you started with. Can you actually say it in Ukrainian?
Yeah. Людина без людей, що дерево без коріння.
Mm-hmm. So it was a person without community is like a tree without roots.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of, like, when you described your journey, for me, it was like, in a way, discovering or just seeing your roots as they are and acknowledging them. For me, I have to say there's a lot of insights that I had, but for me, it was really fascinating to kind of hear your comparisons and your views of the Polish culture. It reminded me that you can look at the Polish culture from different perspectives and you will have a very different view. So, Maria, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It was a pleasure to have you here on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for bringing this topic in this conversation and also to being that open-minded to my perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And listeners, thanks for joining us for the conversation. I invite you to follow the podcast, share it with your friends, comment, and I invite you for the next episode. This time we'll talk about creativity and we'll focus on the perspective of Poland. So I hope to see you next month. Thank you.